Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Art Basel Qatar wrapped up its inaugural edition this past week. And heading into the fair, there was a mix of real excitement and genuine uncertainty. Questions ranged from how the fair experience would differ from a traditional Art Basel mega fair to how meaningful sales would be given the depth of the buyer base in the region. And ultimately, whether this is a fair galleries can return to year after year and find long-term success as exhibitors. In this week's episode of the podcast, we break all of this down with Margaret Carrigan, news editor at Artnet News. Margaret was on the ground in Doha and covered the fair extensively. I definitely recommend checking out her reporting on Artnet News if you haven't already. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Margaret, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Absolutely. Well, I know you just got back from Qatar, so we really appreciate you taking some time to chat with us. And before we dive into the inaugural edition of Art Basel Qatar, I wanted to take a step back and really understand how we got here. Based on your reporting and conversations, why did a Middle East fair make sense now for Art Basel, the brand? And how does Art Basel Qatar fit strategically alongside their other locations, including Basel, Switzerland, Miami, Paris, and Hong Kong?
Yeah, I think the top line for me is that this kind of speaks to the re-regionalization of the global art market that we've been kind of seeing in some other ways over the last couple of years. And I think that just really stems from collectors and dealers. They're not traveling the way they used to. They're being more selective about the events that they do attend. And to that end, like the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, that kind of like broad swath through there that's colloquially known as MENASA, was really the only regional market that Art Basel didn't have a foot in until now. The other locations kind of cover Europe, the Americas, and Asia. And there's so much growth happening in that region, and that's really being centered in the Gulf region, which has a very low tax rates and a young, wealthy population. So it's very appealing for businesses to want to move into that space. And I think that also comes on the heels of other global markets slowing in the last few years. We've seen, noted contraction over the last several years. So I think that it was a kind of a perfect storm. There was growth happening, there's contraction happening elsewhere. And I think they've probably been eyeing this for a while, and it was just right time, right place.
Yeah. And so tell us what the general mood was like heading into the Fair Week, in particular from exhibiting galleries and maybe other insiders who are new to the region. Was there a level of excitement about a new market? Was there maybe some uncertainty from exhibiting galleries about sales and the depth of buyers in the region? Maybe there were mixed emotions. From a gallery perspective, of course, we also have to think about certain costs that they incur when they do a fair.
I think there were mixed emotions. I think a lot of people were excited to see what this fair would look like. It's worth noting that from the outset, Art Basel said that they were going to kind of take a different approach with this, at least for the first edition. So it was a much smaller version of Art Basel. I think when they initially announced it, they said they were only going to have 50 exhibitors, but it ended up being 87 because there was so much interest. And that it was going to have a booth-less format. It definitely had more of a curated vibe to it. They actually brought on a specific curator for the inaugural edition to kind of give it that biennale feel. There wasn't the kind of rigid, hierarchical, big booths to the front, and then emerging galleries, further back or up top or anything like that. So it really was a kind of a reset on the fair model in general, which I think has been in many ways talked about for the better part of a decade in various circles. So I think the interest in that was very high. And it kind of offered a easy way to kind of look at this as an opportunity for not just the region, but for rethinking what fairs can do long term in other places too. And on top of that, I mean, you mentioned something kind of specific. It's like that there's a lot of costs that is associated with doing art fairs. And this was a really low risk environment because Art Basel, with the help of Qatar, underwrote the costs for a lot of exhibitors for this first edition. Booth fees, I think, were only reportedly around $15,000, which is a lot lower than kind of the six-figure major booths that you see at other Basel editions. And there were other amenities provided, whether it was covering installation fees or covering flights or accommodation. So in this particular instance, exhibitors were definitely able to take advantage of the opportunity without incurring the amount of cost that they would for another fair. There were, of course, concerns. I think more geopolitically, there were military tensions in the lead up between US and Iran in the region, very nearby. So, there was like a military buildup happening in the days just prior to the fair. And, there was a whole armada that moved into the Arabian Sea that was very close to Doha. There's an airbase just outside of Doha that Iran actually struck last year during a similar moment of tension between the US and Iran. So I wouldn't say that it was without hiccup, despite all of the kind of the red carpet that was laid for everyone that was coming. And I mean, a few people told me that they were deciding to book their flights late, like maybe just a few days in advance, or in some cases not at all. Like I know one person that I had spoke to before the fair started was, just playing it by ear and seeing if they were going to go, and they decided not to in the end. They just didn't feel comfortable with everything that was going on geopolitically. The other part of that too is I think a lot of people had some skepticism about the market in general in the Gulf, whether it was kind of ready for this top tier fair. It seemed like maybe there was a perception that there was only, a few big collectors, most of them would be royal families in the region. And would that be enough to really drive sales in this instance?
Well, I definitely want to get into sales with you. But before we even do so, I want to ask you a little bit more about the visitor experience. I know you touched on the fact that there weren't booths and it was more of a biennale format. But for our listeners who didn't have an opportunity to experience it firsthand, can you tell us what it was like to be there at the fair and how the experience for visitors differed from a typical Art Basel mega fair?
Oh, Adam, I got to tell you, it felt like a joy. It was not overstimulating or exhausting. I think anyone that's been on the fair circuit long enough knows that you really have to, it's just so headache inducing sometimes to take in that much art, and all these presentations are so crowded and clustered. There's so much going on in each big booth. And we've been seeing kind of a move recently in the last couple of years, I'd say, toward more curated booths every now and again. But, when the dealers want to take that approach. But for a lot of people, a lot of exhibitors, I think Art Basel is the time to just bring the big guns out. It's not always bringing a curated booth, it's just bringing your biggest works. So this was very much different from other editions. And I would say the boothless format, it's not completely without booths. Obviously there were walls there, you need to hang things. But it just had a lot more flow between it. You didn't have people with desks set up in the booths, on their laptops. So it was very much like the open sight line. So you could see from one exhibitor to the next and kind of get a sense of a flow and kind of conversation between some of the works on view. I think Klaus Biesenbeck actually really summed it up for me when I saw him at the fair, and he just said there's no going back to the old booth format in his opinion. He said it's too messy, it's overstuffed, it's distracting. Another collector told me that this kind of fair was a collector's dream, and that he was learning new things about artists that he was even already familiar with because there was just that singularity of the presentation. The exhibitors on the booth stands weren't trying to tell him about 7 different artists or all of these things. They were specifically very knowledgeable and in-depth about one, and in some cases just one specific, era within that artist's oeuvre. So it was a much different kind of educational exercise, I would say. And to that end too, about half of the exhibitors were actually from the region, and many others also brought works by artists that were from the region or had roots there. So it did drive home this kind of regionality aspect I mentioned earlier and made it a much more distinct offering from other Art Basel fairs.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the most common criticisms, perhaps, of art fairs. Of course, there's often complaints that it's not the most ideal way to view art, but additionally, I think generally you're not really able to have really high quality conversations in a fair setting about a particular artist where you can discuss their practice in depth and be educated on it to learn more about it. So that's a really nice feature to be able to have that at this fair.
Yeah, definitely. I'll also say that, even though it was focused on these single artist presentations, another key aspect of this fair was that they had these private viewing rooms. And, when you go to a fair, there's always like these backroom offerings at the booths, but this was a little more elevated. And I think some of the pricier works were in those private viewing rooms. That might speak to future ambitions for the fair, like where they're trying to head with it. Or I think it might also speak a bit to the collecting culture in the Gulf, which one advisor told me is a little bit more quote unquote demure and mindful, if you know that internet meme. But I talked to one Saudi collector while I was there who had actually only come to the fair to see two works that were in those private viewing rooms. He wasn't really necessarily interested in what was on view at the booths. So I think there is that kind of additional cultural aspect to it. That same collector did say that he walked by some sculptures by Simone Fattal that were on display at in one of the gallery's presentations, and he wouldn't have noticed those otherwise and was quite taken with them. So it's kind of a trade-off, I guess, but it seemed to work out for everybody.
So, of course, this is an art fair, and sales are always the big question. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but there did seem to be some uncertainty about the depth of the buyer base in Doha. I think everyone expected the Qatari government and some of the museums to spend and buy at the fair, as they are the key buyers in the region. But overall, how did sales ultimately play out?
I think the biggest difference with this fair was that that sales were a lot slower to be announced. Usually when you're at a different Art Basel edition, it's just like immediately end of the day, they're posting sales. They want you to know they sold well within the first few hours. And there really wasn't much of that at all on the first day. And there were, I would say overall, fewer reported quote unquote big sales. Exhibitors I talked to did report receiving kind of white slips of paper from Qatar museums, which was interested if they were interested in acquiring some works from them. And I don't think that there have been any formal acquisitions yet announced, but I mean, to that point, the Al Thanis, which are the royal family in Qatar, they've been very actively building museums for the last 20 years. They are still building museums now. They have a new contemporary one that's slated to open in 2030 called the Art Mill Museum. So I think, if they were actively looking at that fair for works to put in that museum, and we will see them there in a few years' time. But this also had a knock-on effect. Like, I think some said that the regional buyers may have been waiting to make offers until Qatar museums and the royal family had made their selections, both just out of deference. And that's just, it was like the museums had to make their official selections before others could. But that's not to say there weren't other collectors buying, there weren't other institutions buying. There are two galleries, Nature Mort from India and Mendes Wood, that both, I think, in the first day reported had sold to some museums in the US and Asia. And I think going back to this aspect of kind of like the different sort of layout and how there was sort of a 50-50 split between more regional artists and bigger blue chip names, I think because there was that emphasis on regional artists, some of which are lesser known to a global audience, the prices were understandably lower. So we're not really seeing that same kind of like mega sales announcements that we would see coming out of other Basel editions. But to that end, I think a lot of the galleries who presented works by artists that were from the region, or like I said, had ties to the region, they were sharing a lot of sales kind of in the, under $200,000 range by the end of the week.
Yeah, that definitely sounds promising. And so stepping back, what would you say are some of the big takeaways from the first edition? When you talk to galleries, do they feel the experience was worth it? And do we yet have a feel for what this fair exactly is? Or does it feel like a fair that'll need some time to develop and grow and ultimately mature into what it becomes?
I do think that it needs a little time to develop and grow. And I would say Ivan Wirth of Hauser and Wirth summed it up pretty well when I was speaking to him. He said that this year is not important. Next year is the important year.
Yeah.
To that end, I do think that the first edition of the fair achieved what it needed to achieve, which is it was really polished, it was buzzy, it was new. It provided an opportunity to meet new people, new collectors, and get a sense of the region with very little risk to exhibitors, since it was, in part kind of underwritten by the fair and Qatar. I think the longer view is like, obviously with relatively modest sales or potentially slower sales because of just kind of how the Qatari state is involved in it. Will that kind of ultimately be worth the squeeze for exhibitors, especially if down the line hotels and accommodation and other expenses aren't as heavily underwritten? And I mean, we have to look at the bigger picture too, which is that there's a lot happening in the Gulf in general right now. We have the 20th anniversary of Art Dubai in April, and then Frieze is launching its Abu Dhabi edition in partnership with Abu Dhabi Art in November. So we're really reaching this moment where for a region that only had a couple small regional fairs last year, now the biggest players in them, is like, is that too much too soon? Will it be able to sustain it even if it is rapidly growing? I think personally, plenty of people are going to go back next year just to find out the answers to those questions. Like, I think that there's enough interest generated right now for them to want to know more. And looking a little further down the line, I would say that this is probably a watershed moment for the region, that even if it's not taking off in the same way that other, Art Basel editions are in other regions now, like something has really been started here, and that will only kind of grow and change with what dealers want and what buyers want out of that region. And I think it's a long-term investment that Art Basel's making right now.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how the fair evolves and how it continues to fit within the Art Basel branch among their other fairs. Margaret, thanks so much again for coming on the podcast and helping us recap this first year of Art Basel Qatar. If our listeners haven't already, I definitely recommend they check out all of your incredible coverage of the fair. And if they want to follow you on social media, where can we find you there?
Yeah, you can find me at Real Life Maggie on Instagram.
Perfect. Thanks so much again. Speak soon.
Thanks so much, Adam.